If your blood runs orange and blue, this is the pod for you. You're listening to Orange and Blue Bloods, hosted by EJ Stewart and Tommy Beer. Let's get to it, New York.
And now we play the waiting game. It's EJ Stewart, Tommy Beer. This is Orange and Blue Bloods, a New York Knicks podcast, Audacy, WFAN original, talking Knicks here, plenty to get to on this episode of Orange and Blue Bloods. We will be talking about the deadline being extended for Josh Hart's player option. Josh Hart has an option of about $13 million coming up for this upcoming season. He previously said he would decline that option. Now there's been a delay in the deadline for him to make a decision on that decision to pick up the option. So I'll talk to Tommy Beer about why this delay happened, what it could mean for the Knicks, and what benefits could the Knicks have from Josh Hart accepting the player option, if that is indeed what he's considering. So we'll talk about that. Also, a pseudo long-time Knick is on his way out, potentially. Derrick Rose, one of the more longer tenured Knicks on this current squad. He has not had his player option picked up or his team option picked up by the New York Knicks. So he could be on his way out. That was $15 million supposed to come to his way. He now becomes a free agent. We'll talk about what indications we can get from the Knicks deciding not to pick up his team option, and if there's any possibility Derrick Rose could be back on the New York Knicks next season, and more smoke to the fire potentially involving Donte Divencenzo. Yet another reporter now saying that league personnel around the league is starting to believe that Donte Divencenzo, the Golden State Warriors free agent, will indeed join the New York Knicks offseason to pair up with his old college buddies Josh Hart and Jalen Brunson. So a lot to get to on this episode. Again, my guy Tommy Beer joined me as always. Tommy, how you feeling?
Feeling good. We are just a couple days away from free agency. We're recording this Tuesday afternoon. So free agency will start on Friday around 6 p.m. But we'll start to hear some rumors start to pick up steam. One of them being Donte Divencenzo potentially joining his Nova mates, Jalen Brunson, Josh Hart. So let's start there and talk a little bit about a potential free agent ad for the Knicks and how I'm not sure exactly how it fits. So let's get into it, EJ.
Interesting enough. So again, this is Orange and Blue Bloods, a New York Knicks podcast, Audacy WFAN original podcast. You can get wherever you get your podcasts, including the free Audacy app. Make sure you hit the auto download feature on your streaming service to get these episodes every time we drop. So we begin with the wig game. Like I mentioned, Josh Hart, he makes his decision to extend the deadline to his player option for next season. It was a decision that both him and the Knicks agreed to. Hart previously told Taylor Rooks that he would be opting out of his contract this summer to become an unrestricted free agent, but the pause in the negotiation could mean he's at least considering picking up that option. By doing so, he would leave himself eligible for a potentially bigger payday via a new extension with the Knicks. Knicks will be able to pay Josh Hart $81 million on a 4-year extension if he opts into next season. By doing so, Knicks will also save some money this season, keeping them further away from the dreaded luxury tax. So, Tommy, why do you think Josh Hart elected to extend this deadline, and how realistic is it that he opts in and signs an extension in your eyes?
Yeah, I think it's pretty realistic. I think they're kind of trending in that direction. So let's preface this by just kind of going over some of the particulars and get that out of the way. So on the contract, Josh Hart had previously signed with the Pelicans, actually, but before being traded to Portland, has a player option for next season, the 23-24 season, for $12.9 million. That, upon its inception, upon the signing of the contract, that decision date was set to expire Saturday night. Both teams decided to extend it all the way up to Thursday at midnight, right before the start of free agency. And because it potentially benefits, it does benefit both sides to kind of go in this direction, and potentially it could benefit both sides by having Josh Hart opt in and then signing extension. So just a little bit of the details on that. Previously, under the old CBA, you could only sign a contract for 120% of the final year of the contract. That's been increased from 120% to 140%. So that's one of the reasons why Hart would at least consider this. Because of that increase in percentage, Hart could potentially sign a 4-year extension worth up to $81.2 million. Okay, so why would Josh Hart accept a $12.9 million contract for next season when he could make more than that on the open market? Because the Knicks could opt into that final year of the contract, and then in August, again, it couldn't be simultaneously, but obviously there'd be essentially a handshake agreement that the Knicks would sign him to that 4-year extension. Knicks don't have to give him the full $81.2 million. It could be
Right.
79, it could be 86. I mean, it could be 76, could be, whatever the case is. Obviously, you would assume it's more towards the end of the spectrum. So the benefit for Hart for opting in and extending, he adds an extra year. So instead of 4 years of guaranteed money on the open market, again, that's assuming that another team's willing to, give him a 4-year contract, which I assume there would be plenty. But, would it be at 15 for 4 years per? Would it be at 16? Would it be at 14? We don't know. If he signed the opted in for 12.9 this upcoming season and then signed the 4-year extension, that's 5 years of guaranteed money for Josh Hart. Basically takes him throughout his prime.
Yeah.
If he does sign that, opt in and sign the extension, that's $94 million over 5 years, essentially right around $18.8 million per season, which is probably a little bit higher than market value on an annualized basis for Hart. If you secret polled all 30 GMs, my guess would be they probably feel most comfortable paying Josh Hart somewhere between $13 to $17 million a year, maybe $14 to $18 million a year. So, essentially $19 million a year, maybe a smidge over market value. Why would the Knicks consider this? How would it benefit them? Why would they use to extend? Because again, this was mutually agreed upon, this decision to extend the deadline from Saturday to Thursday. The Knicks, the primary benefit for New York of having Josh Hart opt in for under $13 million this year is it reduces their salary cap commitments for the upcoming season. That's important, obviously, not just because it gives them more cap flexibility in terms of relative to the salary cap, but just as importantly, relative to the luxury tax line. And that's a number, exceed the number, it's basically $1 for tax. And not only does it, this is the thing where just James Dolan's bottom line. It impacts the Knicks' flexibility in terms of being hard capped and the way that they can kind of benefit, the way that they can kind of tweak their roster, not only this offseason, but going forward. So I say all of that to say this, there's pros and cons for both sides. But I think ultimately the Knicks want Josh Hart. He's a perfect fit. I think Hart wants to be in New York. He understands he's a perfect fit. He seems to love playing in New York. Why wouldn't you? He's playing with his buddy, Jalen Brunson. They're a competitive team on the rise in his prime, in the capital of the world. So my guess is, pure speculation, that this gets done. I think he opts in. I think he signs a 4-year extension. I don't know if it'll be the max $81 million. It really wouldn't surprise me, and I don't think that'd be a bad deal. But I see the Knicks kind of having a descending value, as they like to do on their contracts. Does that final year have a player option? Does it have a team option? Those are kind of the things that they'll negotiate on. But I think looking at the big picture, all things considered, this is pointing towards both sides coming to an agreement sometime before Thursday at midnight.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with that. I think if you get to a point where you move the deadline back to Thursday, it makes me feel like there are probably productive enough conversations happening where they feel like, okay, we'll find a way to a number. Maybe we're not there today, but by Thursday, we'll definitely get there at this point. And I think that this would be a great benefit to the Knicks, particularly because you get Josh Hart at that lower number this offseason. And then what happens with that, as you mentioned, it opens up your flexibility when it comes to being further away from that luxury tax. It gives you more flexibility with making sure you can ensure you get that full mid-level exception. You may have to release some guys, and Derrick Rose not being here will add to that as well. So I think in many ways this is a benefit to the Knicks if this does indeed happen. The Knicks have, interestingly enough, they've been benefiting from having players that they sign to descending contracts in terms of value here. This may be a rare occasion where you have it kind of flipped, where the Knicks will benefit today by having a guy at a lower number and then maybe paying him a little bit later. And I think that, essentially Josh Hart's got to make a decision. Look, 5 years, $95 million essentially, which is what you'd be talking about when it comes to a full extension, if that is what the Knicks are offering. Can you get that on the open market? I don't think so. I mean, not in this market. No, these are not for a team that you'd probably want to play for. Like Could the Rockets give you that? Could the Spurs give you that? Maybe, but do you want to play for those teams that are going to be near the bottom, especially the Rockets? Maybe the Spurs will turn around quickly with Wemby, but with the Rockets, do you want to be near the bottom there for a long period of time? I would doubt that. He's talked about wanting to be in the Northeast. He's talked about trying to have a stable situation because of, the newborn twins that he has now with his wife. So this benefits all parties. So I hope that it gets done. We saw Josh Hart and his impact on the team last season. A1 locker room guy, A1 guts and guile kind of guy. And he's the kind of player you need if you're going to end up eventually figuring this thing out and winning a championship. I always like to look at a roster prior to when they ever get to that mountaintop and say, who are guys on this team that I could see being there on the podium when the Knicks are hoisting a Larry O.B. trophy? I feel like Josh Hart feels like one of those guys. And I feel like he's a Bruce Brown. I feel like he's an Aaron Gordon. I feel like he's one of those guys where you say, hey, Knicks brought him in. And it wasn't the first year, it wasn't the second year or the third year. But maybe a couple years down the line, you look at him and say, that move is a move that ended up impacting the Knicks in a big way. And it's the reason why they eventually get over this hump. So Josh Hart, if they can find a way to get it done, I'm all for it.
Yeah, to your point, basically the only teams with that have the cap space, should he opt out and become an unrestricted free agent, Knicks could obviously still re-sign him. But the other teams that have cap space that exceed the mid-level exception, which is essentially right around 12.2 million, a team like the Rockets, the Spurs, the Jazz, that their space is gone with the Josh Collins trade.
Yep.
The Pistons still have space. There's really only 3 teams. The other team is the Magic. The Magic are the one team. If I was Orlando, I would make a serious run at Josh Hart. If he decides to opt out. He's one. They're a team that's kind of obviously still on the rise, but he can kind of establish an identity and show the young kids how to play. Kind of that perfect mix of competitive now, mentor role. Still be competitive a couple of years in the future when you're younger, when your kids and Banchero and those guys get a little bit older and are ready to compete for playoff wins, etc. But there are limited opportunities for Josh Hart should he opt out. And again, just circling back to kind of the money whole situation, as EJ mentioned, the primary benefit of getting Hart to opt in and staying below the luxury tax line this year is it gives you access to the full mid-level to non-taxpayer exception, which is 12.2 million, which opens up a whole avenue of opportunities for guys like Donte Divencenzo, Bruce Brown, and we'll talk about Divincenzo specifically in a bit. Yes, so those are kind of the minutia, the details behind it. Big picture, whether he opts in and they sign an extension, which I think, again, is in his best interest as well as the Knicks, which is why I think it will get done, or he opts out, I still think the Knicks re-sign him. Big picture, the Knicks need to bring Josh Hart back. I think it's one of their top priorities. I understand he didn't play particularly well and was a little bit, his flaws were a little bit exposed in that Miami series. But think about the 25 games from the trade deadline to the end of the regular season where he was part of the second unit. That was the best second unit in the NBA. Grit, guts, competitiveness, a high IQ, solid locker room guy, just a staple of one of those guys that helps you build winning culture is probably an overused cliche in sports today.
Yeah.
He kind of epitomizes it. And that's why the Knicks need to keep Josh Hart around.
I remember it was only his first playoff experience. Because Josh Hart's been around the league for a while and because he kind of has this reputation of being a winning player, I think, there's an expectation that, he's been in the playoffs a bunch and he should have been better in Miami. It's like, well, no, this was his first go around in the playoffs. And by the way, he was really solid against Cleveland. One of the reasons why they won that series, him guarding Donovan Mitchell the way he did, helped the Knicks, just extinguish the Cleveland Cavaliers quickly in 5 games. So Josh Hart is a much needed piece of this team. So if they can get a deal done, that'd be great, especially when you consider the Knicks gave up a first round pick in this year's draft to acquire Josh Hart. So you want to make sure you get the return on that investment by keeping him here long term. So a Tom Thibodeau favorite could be on his way out of New York. The team elected not to pick up the $15 million team option for a point guard, Derrick Rose. Rose fell out of favor and out of the rotation this season and was used in more of a mentor role for the younger players during this past year. It is believed that the Knicks would consider bringing back Derrick Rose at a much lower number. Mark Stein does report that the Bulls, the Suns, and the Bucks are all teams that could have interest in the veteran guard. So, Tommy, when you saw the news come down about the Rose team option being declined, what indications, if any, did you draw from how the Knicks may be approaching this offseason by deciding not to pick up Derrick Rose's option?
Yeah, I thought, unfortunately, it was kind of a no-brainer. Rose had played 26 games in 21, 22, 27 games last year. A lot of those were garbage time minutes. Averaged 5.6 points in 12 minutes a night. And even when he was on the floor, looked like a shell of himself.
Yeah.
Just those accumulation of injuries. We know youngest MVP to the youngest player to win an MVP, and the torn ACL early in the Chicago days, bounced back to kind of revive his career. Had some bright spots in Minnesota, and then came over at the deadline and was, a really important player for the Knicks. Amazingly, he actually played more games post deadline that 2021 season, played 35 games, and he hadn't played more than 27 games in any full season since.
Wow.
He was the best player in that Atlanta series for New York. So credit to D Rose. And again, as you mentioned, another guy that was really important to changing the culture and the way the league viewed this team, teamed up with Thibodeau, and was a significant opponent. I thought the only way that the Knicks would pick up the option or not decline the option would be to if he was involved as kind of a salary filler in a larger trade. But the Knicks still have Fournier to kind of to fill that role. That's the first thing I thought of was, okay, the Knicks don't have anything on the forefront right now. They're not close to making any deal. That was the indication that I got from the Rose, because it just gives them a lot of flexibility. No reason to do it right up until you have to. So that's kind of the case there. And again, the Knicks have plenty of point guard depth. Brunson, what he's going to bring to the table. IQ, 6th man of the year, and Miles McBride, who should get more minutes than he does. So there just is no room for Derrick Rose. I still wouldn't rule him out coming back as kind of a Udonis Haslem, Taj Gibson type end of the bench veteran. That's a reserve / assistant coach. But I personally would love to see him get one last opportunity to put together a healthy season in Los Angeles with the Lakers, or maybe help to get the Bulls back to the playoffs, something like that. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I drew the same takeaways when the news came down that they were going to decline the option. I think that the only reason Knicks would have picked up his option would have been to use him in a trade for a big salary star, at the very least, a big trade involving a lot of players, potentially where you would use that $15 million to match the money needed to make a deal like that happen. The fact that they decided that we're going to decline it essentially meant that there was going to be a likelihood that if they picked up his option, he would have been on the Knicks roster at $15 million. And of course, that was a non-starter. No way you could have that happen. Even if there's a chance of that happening, Knicks couldn't allow that to happen. So that's why the Knicks decide, okay, we're going to decline this option. You mentioned they do have Fournier. So if a deal comes up, we do have someone at a pretty big number that maybe we can hope get something down the road and onto the finish line or past the finish line. But for Derrick Rose, I mean, look, I got nothing but love for Derrick Rose for how he played as a Knick, how he represented himself as a Knick, a much better go around the second time than the first time when he was a Knick during the Phil Jackson era when he went AWOL and that whole situation, how that season went down, a disastrous season for the New York Knicks. I think Derrick Rose really kind of cemented himself as a guy that, and maybe it's not that long from now, maybe a couple years, 3 years, you'll be seeing him at MSG getting a nice ovation from the crowd. As Knicks alumni Derrick Rose, I think that he's definitely now become a part of the Knicks family when it comes to the way Dolan, the way the front office sees him, the CAA connections, of course, with Leon Rose. Rose played well when they needed him to, which was that first year when they brought him in that trade. He was a 6th man of the year candidate, a finalist that year. Played really well in that series against Atlanta. Maybe the only guy that played really well in that series against Atlanta. And since then has been a pro. There's many reasons why this season he could have moaned and complained about not getting enough playing time. He's a guy that's accomplished a lot in this league, and the Knicks put together a team this year that could compete in the playoffs and make a run. And he wanted to be out there. This is at this point in this stage of his career, what he's playing for. He's playing for the opportunity to go deep in playoff runs and try to win a championship. So it probably was tough to sit there on the sidelines and watch the Knicks essentially do that this year without him. But the fact that he handled it like a pro is something that I cannot stress enough was instrumental, I think, to make sure the chemistry of this team was right. Like if him and Fournier really start belly aching and really causing major issues, the chemistry of this team could have been off. I mean, we just talked about last week about this argument Tom Thibodeau had with Obi Toppin, and Obi Toppin coming in this offseason saying, hey, I want more time, or if not, then we need to find a way to trade me. Like, if you already had that bubbling under the surface, imagine what would have happened if you then had also Derrick Rose and Fournier causing other issues as well. So you got to give a lot of credit to Derrick Rose for handling his situation like a pro. When it comes to if I would want him back, I don't know if I would, honestly. It's not anything personal, but I almost feel like at a certain point you kind of have to turn the page to a certain era of Knicks basketball. And I'm not saying the guys that are veterans that can go and help the young guys aren't important, but I want to put the best 12, 15-man roster I possibly can out there. Derrick Rose, at this point, from what I saw him on the court, he just doesn't look like a guy that can play. I don't know if you saw, though, it was interesting. Julius Randle on that PG podcast he was on. I don't know how they got into the conversation about Derrick Rose, but they asked him about Derrick Rose. I think someone asked him what's it like playing with a legend, essentially, and that's what Derrick Rose essentially is. And he talked about, hey, it's great. Derrick Rose is he's a great locker room guy. He's really helped our young guys. And then he said, look, he can still play. He's like, don't get it twisted. He can still play. And one of PG's co-hosts said, I thought he should have played in the playoffs. And Julius Randle kind of chuckled and said, well, don't get me in trouble. It almost sounds like Julius Randle maybe thinks that Derrick Rose has something left in the tank, and maybe he thinks that he's someone that they could have used down the stretch. Like, is there any thought in your mind that maybe Derrick Rose does have something left in the tank and he can contribute to a contender?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I thought I was hesitant when the Knicks made the trade for Rose at the deadline, 2-3 years ago. I certainly didn't envision him be, emerging as a key component on the team. So I'm hesitant to write off guys like that. I mean, Rose has come back from so much adversity. I mean, just the fact he made the NBA from where he grew up, Southside Chicago, the circumstances he escaped to elevate himself to one of the best point guards in the world, the youngest MVP in NBA history. Those are the type of guys that I wouldn't count out. So he didn't play well last year. He didn't look good last year. At the same time, we saw him after he had not played an NBA game for 3 weeks, come in, play 4 minutes, and take a few shots. Very difficult to do under those circumstances. Difficult to look good or sharp or clean and crisp. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes to a team like LA or Chicago or the Clippers, maybe somebody that needs some point guard help, and gives them 18 to 20 solid minutes on and off the bench. He's not a good defender at this stage of the career. He's improved his 3-point stroke, which is obviously immensely important because he's not as quick, not as athletic, not as an elite finisher as he once was. Arguably the most explosive point guard I've ever seen. His dunk over Dragic, maybe my favorite in-game dunk in NBA history. He has all-timer. His high school mixtape is legendary. I mean, people say, people compare, John Morant and some other guys. I mean, but if you watch a young Derrick Rose, those first 3-4 years in the NBA, there has never been anything like that before. I don't think there's been anything like that since. Maybe Westbrook is in that conversation in terms of combination of size, strength, athleticism from elite guard. But Rose was that dude. I think kids today, he gets respect as kind of a revered figure. But I don't know if young folks today understand just how good he was that early on in his career.
Yeah, and one of the biggest pet peeves I have in conversations about basketball is the relitigation of guys getting awards from people who weren't around or don't remember why guys got awards. And one of the biggest relitigations I see all the time on basketball Twitter or the basketball internet is, why did Derrick Rose win that MVP over LeBron James several years back? And it just drives me crazy, because what Derrick Rose did for that Bulls team, making them the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference over that Miami Heat team that had the big three. The way Derrick Rose just completely annihilated essentially every point guard matchup he had that season. And at a time where the point guards back then were killers. You're talking about Chris Paul, you're talking about Darren Williams, you're talking about Rajon Rondo. Look at his head-to-head numbers against all those guys during that season. Absolutely dominating that matchup, offensively and defensively. I mean, he was an absolute killer. You can't just look at how many points a game a guy was averaging and field goal percentage and say, oh, this guy should have won an MVP over that guy. Like, it just doesn't. Presenting those numbers without context is a fool's errand. And I can't stand it when it comes to talking about Derrick Rose and his legacy. He absolutely deserved that MVP. And like you said, definitely one of the best point guards of his generation for sure. And one of those what ifs, you just wonder if he never got hurt, would he have ever left Chicago? Would he have ever won a championship? Like, how does his career trajectory change if that doesn't happen? Do you think Derrick Rose gets in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, I mean, listen, every MVP has. It's a fascinating question. I think a lot of people have said if there's ever a player that won't get into the Hall of Fame that's won an MVP, it's Rose. Man, I think, again, we've talked about this before. It's the Basketball Hall of Fame. So you factor in his one season under Calipari, at Memphis at NCAA level, when he was productive and got his team to a final game, and then obviously state championships in Chicago. I think I'd lean towards putting him in again. I just think, the totality of his career is not necessarily up there, cumulative counting stats, etc. With some other players that have been elevated and elected into the Hall. But one other factor that people like to, Sandy Koufax didn't pitch as long as Nolan Ryan, but this peak was as good, was better than anybody else's, side of Bob Gibson. So I think, those factors, and he did enough. He kind of had that resurgence with the Knicks, obviously late in his career when he was, a finalist for Sixth Man of the Year.
Yeah. He had good years in Minnesota and Detroit too, as a role player.
He had solid years, not dominant, but good enough to to elevate his career statistics to a place where I would feel comfortable voting for him. I think, gun to my head, I think he deserves to get elected into the Hall.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what happened with Derrick Rose, his Hall of Fame case, his career trajectory. He doesn't sound like a guy at all that's looking to retire. So what happens with him next season, and if it is a situation where he's back with the Knicks, it would be something to follow.
Do you think he gets in, EJ?
Something tells me no.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, you're essentially putting him in basically a 4-year window. You're saying comes into the league, rookie of the year, then 3 straight All-Star games, one of them MVP, and then hurt, and then at that point, not a Hall of Fame player, a good player still.
Correct.
A guy who's like a win a Sixth Man of the Year type of player, but not a Hall of Fame player. Is that enough to put him in? My instinct tells me that he won't get in. The guy I think about when I compare him is Penny Hardaway. Penny Hardaway didn't win a championship, didn't win an MVP, but I mean, that's a guy that had essentially a similar window, probably 3, 4, 5, maybe even longer window of being an elite player, but then got hurt and then still played years after that, had some good years, but never, back to that All-Star caliber. And he is not in the Hall of Fame. And I think I've seen some people bubble and say, hey, Penny Hardaway should get in, but I don't see this like case anybody banging the door saying get Penny Hardaway in the Hall of Fame. Now, Penny doesn't have an MVP, so that's a major difference. Penny Hardaway was all NBA first team, so he was an elite player.
Twice.
Yeah.
When there were point guards, when there was elite.
Yes, exactly.
Guard, as you mentioned.
Exactly. So Penny Hardaway was that dude, and he's not in the Hall of Fame because of an injury, or multiple injuries, really. So if that's the precedent, that's why I lean no. If the MVP is what puts him over the top, I could see that happening, but that was why I kind of lean no. It's tough, though. It's going to be tough. I think Derrick Rose has a lot of sentimental value and sentimental love from a lot of people who love this game because of how he plays this game. Yeah, so that could end up putting him over the top. You never know. He kind of has an Allen Iverson kind of feel to him, where it's like it goes again beyond the box score, beyond what he actually did in terms of the numbers. Sometimes it's just the impact, the cultural impact that a guy has. And D Rose, he definitely checks that box in a major way.
I just looked it up. Penny only finished inside the top 10 in MVP voting once. He was third in 95-96, behind Jordan and the Admiral.
There you go. So it's gonna be interesting. It's gonna be interesting. I'm very curious when Derrick Rose retires what the lay of the land is and his MVP, excuse me, his Hall of Fame case. But because good luck to Derrick Rose in this offseason. Hopefully he finds a home and he can go out there and contribute to some team. And if it's the Knicks, then hopefully he can come here and continue to be the solid veteran mentor that he's been. Okay, so it is feeling more and more like a formality that the Warriors free agent guard Donte Divencenzo will be joining the Knicks this offseason. Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports adding fuel to that fire, reporting this morning as we record on Tuesday that there is, quote, growing noise among league personnel about Divincenzo joining former Villanova teammates Jalen Brunson and Josh Hart in New York. So we talked about Donte a little bit in the past, in the previous episode we just did last week, talking about some of the rumors that were going out there that the Knicks were indeed interested. That was from Ian Bagley. And now you got Jake Fisher, Yahoo reporter, saying that the talk around the league is that Divincenzo will be joining the Knicks this offseason. So thinking about this from more of a formality standpoint, of course, nothing is written in stone, so we'll see what happens. But let's just say Divincenzo is signed to the Knicks, and we'll talk about maybe the money in the next, couple of minutes. But putting him on this roster as currently constructed, how do you see Divincenzo fitting into this rotation?
Okay, so we'll table the money talk for a minute.
Yeah.
Here's my thing. Final game of the Knicks 22-23 season, Game 6 in Miami. The 5 starters: Brunson, Randall, Barrett, Grimes, and Mitch Rob. Hart and Hartenstein and Obi coming off the bench. So 7 of those players played more than 18 minutes. The 5 starters plus Hart and Hartenstein. Obi played 12, and Deuce McBride got 3 minutes. So that there's your 9-player rotation. If Divincenzo comes here, where does his minutes come from? In other words, if you're signing a guy to a mid-level extension and he's agreeing to a mid-level extension over plenty of teams will offer, essentially, I don't say every team that can offer a mid-level extension would be willing to give Divincenzo that contract to him. But he's in an elite class of that type of player. So would he be comfortable coming into that? Does Tibbs tell him, listen, I'm going to 10 guys next year? But even in that scenario, do you reduce Hart? Do you reduce Hart's minutes? Do you reduce Grimes' minutes? Do you reduce IQ's minutes? And obviously, as I mentioned, those 7 guys doesn't include Emmanuel Quickley, who's the 6th man of the year. So that's the only thing. That's the only the other. And the one other thing we talked about last year is remember, DiVincenzo had to settle for a $4.5 million contract last year.
Yeah.
And part of it was because he didn't live up to expectations in Milwaukee, and then during a short stint in Golden State. A short stint in Sacramento. When he got traded to the Kings. Coming into his career, I was looking at the numbers today. Over his first 3 years of his career, he shot below 35% from 3-point range. The prior season before signing with Golden State, he was shot 35% from the floor. That's not, that's 42 games between the Bucks and the Kings. Was injury prone, had a poor assist to turnover ratio, 2.8 to 1.7. So, are you buying high? And that's something we've talked about here. How much do you attribute to his career high efficiency numbers to playing alongside Steph and Draymond and Clay and those guys? So those are the things that give me pause. But again, he's a competitor, he's a grinder. Familiarity comes from a winning program. Relationships with Brunson and Hart, I think all those work in his favor. So I wouldn't be opposed to bringing him in. Again, my biggest concern essentially is finding enough minutes for him. And it's sort of like starting pitching. You can never have enough of effective guys that contribute on both ends of the floor. He's not a plus defender, but he's not a negative either. Maybe a little bit above average offensively, and has some versatility. Can guard point guards and shooting guards and some small forwards. So in a vacuum, I like the player. I like I like the fit in New York in terms of culture and attitude and IQ and competitiveness, etc. I'm just not sure if it makes sense for both sides unless there's other moves to be made. In other words, is this if they sign Divincenzo, does that mean that another move's on the horizon?
Yeah, I think I have a sneaky suspicion that maybe there is, and I'll get to that in a second. But on the Divincenzo front, look, Divincenzo, you talked about his 2022 season where you're talking about shooting 35% from the field in mixed action with the Bucks and with the Sacramento Kings. One thing that is important about Divincenzo's story is, remember that year the Bucks won a championship, 2021. He did not play really in those playoffs. He had a serious injury, a torn ligament in his ankle. They thought he'd be ready to come back in the next season. I don't think he was ready at all. I think that's why you saw those numbers suffer so greatly when he came back. He was ineffective for the Bucks. They shipped him out to Sacramento, and the thought was, well, he's had some time to get right, and he'll play better here. He'll have more opportunity here. And I think Sacramento looked at him as a guy saying, hey, we're trying to build a winning culture here. This is a guy we want to keep. And he played really poorly for them. So they said, take a hike. We don't want him back. So he goes to the Warriors this past season. He starts 36 games this year, some of those with Steph and Clay having injuries, and has a really solid season. The question to me is he, kind of moved past and gotten beyond that injury he had in 2021 that suffered, that greatly impacted his numbers in 2022? Is he a different player? Or like I said in the last episode, is he a guy who benefited from being in a great situation where you're playing with Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson, and the Steve Kerr offense, and you're getting a lot of wide open looks. Defenses are running like madmen to try to chase Curry and Poole and Thompson in the three-point lines. You're the guy getting these great looks. Does that change when the guy stretching the floor with you is Josh Hart? Does that change when the guy stretching the floor with you is Obi Toppin? Like, these are real questions I think that you have to ask, and I don't know if we quite know the answer. I mean, again, the only other team he played with that he had a lot of success with was Milwaukee. Again, another team, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Chris Middleton. Like, he's, for one season, Drew Holiday. Like, another team where you're Drew Lopez. You're running around trying to keep Giannis out the paint and then chase those other guys. So Divincenzo is the guy that ends up getting good looks. Those have been the best years of his career. So who is Donte Divincenzo? I don't know if it's necessarily this like slam dunk that he's definitely like a baller. Now, I do think that he's a grinder. I do think that he's a hustle guy. I do think that he's a guy who plays the right way. How effective will he be? I think it's a little of a question mark, which is why, like, I have not been that keen on the Knicks, like this being the guy that they give essentially maybe their full mid-level exception to. Like, I look at what the Knicks were missing last year. I don't think it was guts and guile. I think a lot of people thought this was a pretty tough physical team. I think you look at this team and said they need more shot creation and they need more shooting. And then probably some more perimeter defense, and maybe Divincenzo can help you with that. Right. But those first two things maybe being the first things on the docket, the Divincenzo add to that, I'm a little skeptical, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you can sign Seth Curry for $3 million or Divincenzo for 12, like if you, again, this is kind of fitting pieces into a roster, a ready-made roster. I don't know, again, obviously Divincenzo's a better player, and there's he's more versatile, but Watanabe, Javon Carter, Torrey Craig, Ingles, Kendrick Nunn. There's just some other names that are floating around there that you could potentially get at a steeper price where you don't have that same competition. And for precisely what the Knicks need, which is, you could argue, more of a spot up shooter that's going to knock down open threes and kind of spread the floor. Divincenzo doesn't have a career. And the fact that two franchises basically gave up on him inside 4 years of being drafted is not an overly encouraging sign. But I think you make a good point that has to be taken into consideration. Was that 21-22 disappointing season due primarily to ankle injury, rushing back, and not being quite set? And yes, playing alongside Steph Curry helped, but so did being healthy and maturation. Right. And he's going to be 26. He was 26 years old. So he's not a youngster. He does fit the Knicks timeline in that he can win now, but also part of their kind of youth and development culture. I think the positives for signing him are that worst case scenario, he's not a fit in terms of minutes and stylistically and Tibbs and etc. He still will have trade value 6 months from now, a year from now. Yeah. So it's not like you're inking him to this big long-term contract, hoping that he's going to help turn the franchise from loser to winner. It's more of an ancillary complementary piece. So if he doesn't quite fit, you can shake things around. And again, guys at that contract level, as we've seen, and again, we talked about it for the first couple of weeks since the season ended, and you've already seen it, guys. This new CBA is no joke. It's why the Atlanta Hawks dumped John Collins for a second-round pick. It's why the Wizards couldn't get didn't get a single first-round pick in exchange for Brad Beal. A lot of pick swaps, and he had a no-trade clause, and all that stuff's factored into it. But again, this is a new day and age in the NBA where salary structure is really, really important. So having a player that is a positive, potentially make a positive impact on both ends of the floor. And he did have a positive plus minus in Golden State last year. He did. I looked at his defensive numbers. They gave up 3 fewer points with him on the floor than with him on the bench. So again, there's a lot to like there. It certainly wouldn't be a bad signing by any means. But I'm like you. I can be talked into it. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm not. Oh my God, this is the piece that's going to put the Knicks over the top. I think there are some questions there in terms of opportunities, minutes played, fit, and all that stuff. But again, if you're talking about this is the best opportunity you have, then it's certainly worth considering. Would Bruce Brown be a better fit, a little bit more of a defender, a little bit more of a glue guy? All those things. And to your point, you don't have to spend that $12.2 million all in one place. You could spend 4 here, 5 there, and this kind of gives you a little bit of a little versatility, a little insurance. So we'll see what.
Do you think that Donte gets the full 12? He comes in.
I think yes. I think because if the Knicks don't give it to him, another team will. So I think the Knicks will be forced to, the Knicks will be forced to go there. Essentially, they might not like to, and he probably would be willing to sign for maybe 10. But when he looks at the numbers, $6 million over 4 years, his agent, and then the rest of them will tell him, listen, I understand if you want to play with Brunson and Hart in New York, but let's go to the Pistons and get our full 12.
Yeah, the agents want to get that full commission from Detroit, and then take less from that standpoint. Yeah, I mean, look, Divincenzo, and when I saw this news come down and how Fisher connected it to playing with Josh Hart and Jalen Brunson, part of me wondered if this delay that you have in Josh Hart in this deadline with his player option had something to do with maybe the Knicks trying to back channel and say, hey, Divincenzo, like, what's the number that we can get you at? And how can we make sure we're under the luxury tax, but have enough for the full mid-level exception? Like the Knicks could be kind of maneuvering behind the scenes, like all of these teams are. Everybody's tampering. Everybody's doing what they have to do to make sure they're ready once that date hits and free agency starts in a couple of days, that they all know what's going on and what it is. So some of that could be connected. Is there any value, you think, to like the Knicks, like the fact that he's joining 2 Villanova Wildcats? Like, is there any value to having a bunch of guys that played on the same team? Like, do you think that's, I think about, playing, like, there's a video game, Marvel Ultimate Alliance, and, there are all these characters, and it was, all these different Marvel characters, but you got a bonus. You put, Wolverine, Cyclops, and Storm together. Like, you got a little extra boost to your team because you put 3 X-Men together. Like, even though you don't have to, you could use Spider-Man the Hulk. Is there any benefit to saying, oh, we should get Donte Divincenzo because we got 2 Villanova cats already here, and there's some benefit, there's some chemistry that can be built here?
Yeah, I think so. I'm of the belief, actually, that it's probably a little bit underestimated in terms of the importance of chemistry. And, winning obviously is the most important thing, and having talented players trumps all. But listen, if you're an office manager and, you'll work at an Avis or an insurance company, ideally, your employees are going to be more productive if they enjoy working together, if they enjoy getting up and going to work together. If they don't bicker behind each other's back and and hate each other, if they go out for drinks after work, that kind of stuff spills over. I found in my life that it leads to a more productive, a happier, more docile work environment. Leads to more productivity. So I think there's definitely something to be there. It doesn't necessarily have to be they went to college together. Maybe they are, work for the same agency, so they spend 2 weeks in California training together, or they both went to Hakeem's big man camp and developed a relationship, and their families vacation together. Things like that. We see it in football often when guys will, do mini camps, not mandatory, but then they'll go out and, pitch and catch each other for, rent a house in Florida and, get their families together, that type of thing. So I think it can, lead to, have kind of ancillary benefits. And one other thing, just as far as the money's concerned, and you asked if he's going to get the full mid-level, assuming the Knicks waive the non-guaranteed contracts of DeJuan Jeffries and Isaiah Roby, I did the math as best I could. I have them right around 11.9, 12 million. So I think they'd be a couple, like a couple 100,000 short. I don't think that would prevent them from, they could offer obviously the full mid-level, but they would be about 12 million under the luxury tax. So that's, maybe they would max out at 12 million and then bump it up going forward. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm sure Brock Aller and those guys have ways to kind of manipulate, clear out a couple 100,000 here or there. But again, assuming they guarantee the contracts of Deuce McBride, which they should, they will, and Jericho Sims, they should, they will. They'd be just they wouldn't be able to offer the full 12 million while staying below the luxury tax. So something to keep in mind. Again, I don't think that's going to be a deal breaker, but again, I am interested in the fit, and if that meant that if they do sign him, does that mean that more moves are on the way? Obviously, the one player that's rumored that to potentially get dealt would be Obi Toppin, but moving Obi doesn't really, I guess you could move Hart to the 4, have him play some 4, have DiVincenzo play some 3. There's some options there, but there's not of all the players rumored to be potentially on the table, there's not a clear spot to get this guy out, trade him for a future first rounder or 2 second rounders, and slot DiVincenzo in there. But we'll see.
Because we talked about what moves could be happening by bringing DiVincenzo in, because you're talking about a guy that essentially he has to be added to the rotation. He's not a guy you would think that would take minutes from somebody. My thought was, what is the future of IQ? I'll be honest. Like, that was where my head went, because my thing was, and you're not going to give away IQ. That's not happening. But, if you are talking about trades with the Clippers for Paul George, you are talking about bigger star moves that come down the pipe. And you say, why is it so important to make sure you have Josh Hart locked into a long-term deal here? Why is it so important that you get Donte Divencenzo, another guard, when you have 2 backup guards already, and Deuce McBride, who doesn't get enough time, as you mentioned, and Emmanuel Quickly, who's 6th man of the year? Why is it so vital to get a guy like that who maybe doesn't necessarily fit a need? Well, maybe you just need the bodies. Like, maybe you're going to need guys to fill out a 9 to 10 man rotation when the dust settles. So that was the one thing I thought about when I saw this. I'm not saying that they're trying to ship IQ out of here, but could Donte DiVincenzo be a little bit of insurance if indeed you do have to include IQ in a trade for one of these stars? I think that is something to pay attention to.
That's something I hadn't considered. It's a good point. I guess they could to potentially work out a sign and trade or something along those lines to bring DiVincenzo. When you get a lot of working parts, that's kind of why free agency is so crazy, is because we've seen teams get burns trying to manufacture signs. That's why in the new CBA they shrunk the time. It used to be 3 days. Now it's just 1 hour, because teams can kind of get stuck when you extend an offer to a restricted free agent, then you have to actually hand it to them. We saw that when the Rockets were chasing the Knicks around Vegas to trying to get Jeremy Lin's contract details worked out. Deep cut there. For you.
Yeah, no, that's an old school. That's an old school cut. Did you see on I forgive me to the YouTube channel that did interview Baron Davis. I don't remember off the top of my head, but did you see that they talked to Baron Davis? He essentially said that the whole insanity thing really messed with Melo's head. I always thought about including it on the show, but I didn't. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about it later in the week. But yeah, it was Baron Davis has some interesting comments about what Linsanity was like, and how it impacted the locker room, and again, particularly how it impacted Carmelo Anthony. Very fascinating. Again, maybe I'll tweet it out, after we record this, or maybe after this episode's out, so people will actually know what I'm talking about. But yeah, he talked about that. So deep cut there on the whole end of Linsanity, where the Knicks decided not to match Jeremy Lin's poison pill contract.
Linsanity was a crazy time. One quick factoid: I had an opportunity to interview Clyde when they first opened up his restaurant. So they're trying to get some exposure. So I sat down and had a few apple juices with the man, the myth, the legend, Clyde himself. And I asked him. I talked about Game 7. Reed limping out of the tunnel. I talked about 73 and yada yada yada. And in that context, I asked him, what's the loudest you've ever heard the Garden? Was it Larry Johnson's 4-point play? Was it Reed stepping onto the floor? And he said Linsanity. Without a doubt, for him, the loudest he had ever heard Madison Square Garden was kind of at the peak Linsanity. I think we talked about the Lakers game and some other games, but he said that was a time unlike any other. And he's been around the Garden for more big moments than probably anyone else on earth. So I thought that was interesting.
As Baron Davis had said in that podcast he did, it was essentially like a guy came out of nowhere and became a face of the NBA. That's essentially
only Only player in Knicks history to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated 2 times in a row.
Wow. I didn't even know. That's a very interesting
Yeah,
fact.
yeah. I think it's something like that, or twice in the same month, and he's also the only Knick to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated and Time magazine the same week. Like it was a real thing.
Shout out to the great Jeremy Lin. Maybe we'll try to get him on the podcast at some point. He'd be a good guest. But I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode of Orange and Blue Bloods with myself and Tommy Beer. Of course, this is a New York Knicks podcast, an Audacy WFAN original, a podcast you can get wherever you get your podcasts, including the free Audacy app. Make sure you get the auto download feature on your streaming service to get these episodes every time we drop. We drop 2 times a week during the off season, unless there's some breaking news or whatever. And of course, we'll just do whatever we have to do to get back on. So make sure you hit that auto download feature on your streaming service. So whenever we drop, you'll get the notification, or you'll go to your streaming service and see that we're there and you can listen to us. But also, by the way, you can catch us on YouTube as well. You can find us on the Audacy Sports channel and the WFAN channel if you want to watch this podcast. Tommy, let people know where they can find you.
At Tommy Beer on Twitter.
You can find me, EJ_Stewart on Twitter, Action EJ on Instagram. Make sure you subscribe to Tommy's newsletter. Make sure if you're checking out the WFAN host schedule and you see me on there, make sure you listen to me on WFAN. Make sure you check out New Generation Podcast Network and New Generation Media to catch all of our other stuff outside of this Knicks preview here with Audacy and WFAN. But that's going to do it for this edition of Orange and Blue Bloods. Thank you guys again for checking us out. For Tommy, I'm EJ. Take it easy, guys. Peace. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. If you want to see more of our videos, be sure to check out our playlist and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Also, don't forget to follow us on social media to stay up to date on our latest podcast ventures. Links will be in the descriptions. And as always, thanks for watching, and we will see you in our next video.